This is a short talk on descriptive translation studies and the concept of norms or translation norms. It fits into our subject in the following way. We've looked at structuralism, we've looked at equivalence as a response to structuralism. Skopos is then a critical response to equivalence theories. And now norms or descriptive translation studies is really another response to equivalence that happened in parallel or at the same time as Skopos theory, but in different countries and with different purposes and really in a different discipline. As we'll see, the Skopos people were basically concerned with training translators. The norms descriptive people were more literary scholars working in the field of comparative literature and trying to understand how translation works in those kinds of systems. So they're quite different. Just to recap, equivalence will basically say that the translation should reproduce the values of the ST. And Skopos then retorts, well, that's okay, but it's not enough. We have to achieve the purposes that the client asks us to work on. So when we get a translation, we should ask why. Why are we doing this translation? For whom, with which purpose? And then we can go beyond equivalence. Descriptive translation studies has a different take on it. Gideon Toury, who formulated the basic concepts in his 1995 book, called Descriptive Translation Studies and Beyond, talks about the things we're studying as assumed translations. We just have a set of texts, and for one reason or another, we assume they are translations. And once we assume they are translations, we also assume that there is an equivalence relation with an anterior text, even when there is no anterior text, as is the case of pseudo-translations, that is, translations presented as if they were translations, but they're not, they're original creations. A famous example is Don Quixote, but there was also a Gaelic poet called Ossian, who never existed. They were presented as translations, but they were original text. I think in Australian literature, there's an Australian Aboriginal author, Wonga, who never existed. His translator was the author. Okay, we'll talk about them a bit later. Anyway, the important point is that for descriptive translation studies, all translations are always equivalent, and now we have to set out and find out about what kind of equivalence they established. And that what kind of equivalence leads on to a lot of historical and cultural diversity. We find that translations establish many, many different kinds of equivalence. So it's quite a different way of thinking. The descriptive translation studies people worked in the 20th century, at the end of the 20th century, well, from the 60s and 70s, really. But they worked from early systemic work on cultural products and cultural systems done by the Russian formalists at the beginning of the 20th century. One strand led through to these scholars, Evan Zohar and Toury and others, working in Tel Aviv in Israel. Another strand led through scholars working in what was then Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. They might be called the Prague School, and they developed a different kind of approach. And then a third strand leads through these scholars, Holmes, Lefebvre, Lambert, etc., who were from or working in the Low Countries, that is, Netherlands and especially Flanders in northern Belgium, also drawing on the Russian formalists. Now, these three strands met up in the late 1960s and into the 1970s and talked about what they were going to do. They put out a collective book called The Manipulation of Literature, edited by Theo Hermans, and that earned them the name the Manipulation School early on. And it wasn't really until Gideon Turi's 1995 book that the name Descriptive Translation Studies sort of stuck with this group of people. Here they are. I think this is from the late 1970s. I won't go through them all. They're not all major scholars. Not everybody stuck around in translation studies, but you've got the main people. I'm giving you the names. That's Gideon Turi there, Evan Zohar there, André Lefebvre, Theo Hermans, and this guy is Jimmy Holmes, James Holmes, an American living in Amsterdam, who actually wrote the foundation paper outlining what translation studies as a discipline might look like. So there they are. They look like the Beatles or the Rolling Stones back in the day. Okay. And I thank Josie Lambert, who was there, for sending me the photo. The main concepts that these people would have agreed on, and I've put here the names of the main people who would have made the agreement or outlined the position, are as follows. Firstly, that translation studies is empirical. It sets out to discover things. That means it's not just pedagogical, it's not going to correct translators or train them, and it's not just theoretical. It's not just outlining ideas about what translation is. It's going to go out into the world and find out what is happening. From Evan Zohar, we have the idea of polysystems, which is really just another word for a culture. A culture is seen as a system of systems, and those systems might be the education system, cinema, television, but it might also be the language and linguistics, it might be the military, it might be politics. All these things are within a polysystem, and the question then is, where is translation within the polysystem? And Evan Zohar's basic questions were, do translations occupy a central position, which means that they're active in bringing about change in the polysystem, or a more peripheral position, which means that they are more derivative, more reinforcing, more conservative in their functions. Most of the studies done by Evan Zohar tend to find that translations are rather conservative and peripheral, but there are cases where they have been quite central and innovative. A precept common enough to most of these scholars, but really formulated most forcefully by Gideon Turi, is that we should look at translations firstly in the way they function on the target side. That is, with respect to the receivership, the function it has to fulfill in the target polysystem, as it was called in the period, and with respect to publishers and what other networks should be there. This is where a radical break was made with translator training, which traditionally starts by looking at the start text so that we can find fault with the translation. Turi says, no, we're not going to do that. We're not really interested in finding faults with the translations. What we want to find out is what they're doing in the new culture, and so we're going to start looking at that side. This target side priority was actually shared with Skopos theory for different reasons, but with the same result. Part of that target side focus implies that the purpose of the science is not to be prescriptive, to tell translators how to translate, but instead to describe. And it went on to describe not just translations as texts, although literary scholars tend to focus on texts, but the main contribution, especially of André Lefebvre, was to look at the workings of literary fame and the importance of patronage and the networks of people and support within which translators work. So that might include the people who are financing them, giving them money to live, or publishers as well. So it becomes quite a sociological study for Lefebvre. I want to move now towards the notion of norms. And to introduce this, just let me refer to this man, Savory, who was a scientist. He's studied spiders. And in 1957, he wrote a small book on translation. And he complained about all these translation theorists who have never agreed on anything, he says. He finds some theorists say that translators should give the words of the original, and others say, no, it's not the words, it's the idea. Fair enough. Those might be two kinds of equivalence. The translation should read like an original, but others say, no, it should read like a translation. It should reflect the style of the original. No, the style of the translator. If you're rendering an old text, let's say Dante's Divina Commedia, into English, should you use Old English of the same period as Dante, or contemporary modern English, or something halfway? Nobody's really agreed on that one. Should the translator add or omit? Well, Bible translators, in the Bible it says you can't add or omit anything from the word of the Lord, and that has been taken over into many Western concepts of what translation is. But if we look around, we find plenty of translators who are adding and omitting material for one reason or another. A final one, a translation of verse should be in verse, as we tend to do into English these days, but there are those who believe that a translation of verse should be in prose. And this was a norm, still is to some respect, of translations into French from the neoclassical period through to the early 20th century at least. On all these points, there are no universal rules or laws about what all translations should be. That is, no one can say a translation is good because it does any of these things. On all these points, there have been debates, and there have been, how shall we put it, a sort of agreement, temporary agreement in certain cultures at certain times that some things are more acceptable than others. And those would be norms. I just want to insist on the intense variability of these norms. If we look at traditional oral cultures where narratives are handed down from generation to generation through constant retelling and performance, we find that the retelling and performance can be in different languages, in different varieties of languages, in different registers, and there's a process of constant retranslation in which the language barrier is often not the major thing that they're dealing with. So the concept of translation there changes quite differently, and the norms do as well. As to adding and taking away, if you've got a concept like the Arabic tarjama, which becomes terjemah in Indonesian and Malay, you can see in the semantic range of that concept that it's allowing far more freedom than our contemporary notion of translation does in English. It can mean to explain, to bring out the meaning, to make something clear, to give reason or offer an explanation, and then to convey speech, and here's our translation concept for us, to transfer speech from one language to another. My thanks to Harry Aveling out at Monash for showing me that this concept allows a different range of norms to occur in the name of terjemah than would occur in our contemporary concept of translations into English. Historical study can also bring out strange differences and make us aware of the limitations of our own translation concept. This is just an example from a 12th century translation of the history of the kings of Brittany, big and little Brittany, into Old French. Halfway through the text, we get this eruption of the first person, ne puis ce livre translateur, I don't want to translate this book. And who is this I speaking? Well, the I is the translator who has been translating for half the book. And then suddenly at this point you say, I don't want to translate this bit. Now, that can't happen for us with our concept of translation, because when the translator is translating, they have no first person, singular. If I'm translating and I say I'm hungry, it's not me that's hungry, it's the author that's hungry. This is the alien I. Actors also use the alien I. And that's part of our translation concept, but it seems not to have been part of the translation concept in the 12th century, or not to the same extent, as we can see in this example. I'm also intrigued to find that the Chinese translator Yan Fu, working at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, would cast his translations into the third person, that the author is put as the third person. He's translating Huxley, and he says, Huxley looked out. And we say, well, is that translation for us? Probably not these days, and not in China these days. But for Yan Fu, this was a legitimate part of his translation activity. He was operating with a different kind of norm. Other examples, this is 12th century, this is Ptolemy coming through Greek, Syriac, Arabic into Latin in Spain. This is the translation of the text. Over here, we have copious notes and attempts to understand the text. Why? Because the role of the translators was not just to render what was in the text, they also had a pedagogical, a philological function, trying to make sense of the text and use it for teaching. That's quite different from the kinds of translations we have these days. Here's a more extreme example of it. This is a 15th century Bible rendered from Hebrew into Spanish. This is the first page of Genesis. In that little box there you have the translation. All the rest are explanations of what was happening in the Hebrew text and how it's rendered into Spanish and the different versions available. Why? Because the translator was employed to explain what was going on. Here's his client, the Grand Master of the Order of Calatrava in Spain. Here's the hierarchy of the warrior knights of that order. And here down the bottom you might see the translator, the rabbi, holding up his translation, which is half as big as he is, which I think means he's made to look very small, a servile translator working in the interests of the client. Anyway, that's not the kind of Bible translation that we consider normal today. And this is just an example of the French I was talking about. This is Poe. As you know, I hope, once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Okay, it rhymes, it scans. That's verse in English. Baudelaire, putting this into French, you can see it on the page. It is prose. It's rhetorical prose. You could read through. It's got Je méditais, fatigué, doctrine oubliée. It's worked, but it's still prose and not verse. Why would the French not translate verse as verse? Well, there are many possible reasons, but it might be because they thought that no other culture could write verse as good as French, especially the French Alexandrine. Anyway, we'll come back to that hypothesis a little bit later. Here's a further example of different translation norms. When Harlequin or Mills and Boon romance novels are rendered into different languages, they are generally trans-edited. Trans-edited means that they're translated, the language is changed, but also the length is altered to quite rigorous constraints, because some cultures want a short novel, others want a longer novel, and especially the representation of sexuality is rigorously controlled according to the acceptability limits of the receiving culture. So these are different kinds of norms from what we would normally associate with translation. The man who did most to establish the concept of descriptive translation studies, or as a set of research concepts really, was Gideon Toury. There was the first book, but the main book that I refer to here is this one, 1995, with a revised edition in 2012. And it's here that we find a formalization of the concepts of norms and then universals or laws. So here's what Toury has to say about concepts. And I just want to focus on the phrase here, performance instructions appropriate for and applicable to particular situations, specifying what is prescribed and forbidden, and what is tolerated. It should be proscribed anyway, and what is tolerated and permitted. So in the diagram that we have here of any of those points about which translation theorists have never agreed, we'll find that it's no one thing that all translators do, but they could do anything from there to there. Any of those solutions would be acceptable, but if they go too far, that's not acceptable, and if they go too far this side, then it's not acceptable. So translation norms are not laws, they're not universal rules, they're not just transitory conventions either, because, says Toury, if you do not comply with a norm, that is, if you come into high disapproval down here, for example, then there is some kind of punishment. You will lose your readers, or lose your clients, or lose your authors. Something bad is going to happen, or you may be locked up and punished. I find it interesting to compare Toury's few comments on norms, which are taken here from fairly behaviorist sociology, with what Niklas Luhmann has to say about norms. Luhmann was a German sociologist. And he says that norms are counterfactually stabilized behavioral expectations. And this counterfactually means that the norm exists even when the practice is otherwise. For example, it's a norm of most European legal systems that murder is illegal and is to be punished. Yet there are still murders. And the fact that there are murders does not remove the norm that people expect you not to murder, and they're going to punish you if you do commit murder. And then in times of war, where you get a good deal of the population dedicated to murdering people, the law somehow doesn't change its expectation. It simply opens up a different category of military law when different rules apply. This is just to say that the norms are not subject to statistical testing. This becomes important when we consider ways of discovering norms. If you go back to Toury as well, he's talking about performance instructions, tolerated and permitted. He's not talking about counting up how many people do a particular thing. Norms here and here in the sociology behaviorist or systems-based sociology of Luhmann are not statistically verified. Okay, you'd want to be looking for statements, for people saying or giving opinions, giving qualitative data about what is acceptable and what is less acceptable and what is going to be punished. Andrew Chesterton, who's a British translation theorist, has tried to formalize this problem in the following way. He distinguishes between three kinds of norms. One of them is expectation norms, of the kind the reader expects a translation to be like this. If you're a French reader in the 19th century, you expect Poe, the American versifier, to be in prose. Another kind of norm, then, is what translators believe they do as they're translating. These are production norms, and we can look at the way translators work and try to get the norms from there, or we can interview the translators and ask them about it. And then another kind of norms, says Chesterton, are developmental norms. When we look at what translators get better at in the course of their career or indeed in their training. So we have quite a lot of studies that compare novice translators with expert translators and see what the difference is. And that will give you an idea of some kinds of norms that are operative in the society. And we're going to look at developmental norms next week. At the moment, I'm going to focus more on the expectation and production norms. When Turi proposed that norms was the way to organize research on translation, we got a whole lot of doctoral theses that went out and discovered norms. And we found some of the diversity that I've tried to indicate here. And Turi then starts to reflect on this and says, well, what can we discover beyond these isolated observations? Is it possible to take all these norms that we know about and to arrange them on some higher level as general tendencies? And so at the end of his 1995 book, he proposes two laws of translations, of which I'll present one here. It's proposed law of interference, the idea you can find in Evans-Zohar as well prior to Turi. There are several formulations of it. I'll give you what I think is the simplest formulation. The more a culture feels prestigious, here we might think of neoclassical French culture, the less it will tolerate interference through translation. And interference here simply means structures and concepts that are foreign to the culture and could be imported. They are interference. It sounds very negative in English, but in Turi and Evans-Zohar, the term interference has quite a neutral sound. I mean, it just means that we're importing things from the other culture. So for French neoclassical culture, which believed itself to be the epitome, the heights of civilization, there was no reason to accept interference, that foreign verse forms coming in, and so they worked into prose, and it seems to work there. It also works in certain genres, I think, where some genres accept more interference than others. Now, a counterexample would mean when a culture is less prestigious, it will tolerate interference. And here we find some intriguing examples. For example, into Hungarian, there are science fantasy novels, that's right. This is research by Aniko Zohar, and she finds that these science fantasy novels written in Hungarian are presented as translations from American English. That is, a Hungarian guy writes the novel and then gives himself an English-sounding name and then signs as a translator. So it's a pseudo-translation. Why? Because in this particular genre, it's prestigious to be from American English. The same thing into Hebrew. They had all these cowboy Western novels, which were originally written in Hebrew, but they should have come from the United States, and so they were pseudo-translations. The writer in Hebrew invents an original English which didn't exist, that is, invents an author and presents it as a translation. I find these interesting questions. We don't know if it's always true. We can find counterexamples usually. The American translation scholar Lawrence Venuti argues that Anglo-American culture of the 20th century, 21st century, I suppose, feels itself to be so prestigious that it domesticates, that it reduces the otherness of the text imported, that it has low tolerance of interference. I don't know how true that is. We'd have to go down and actually do the analysis, the historical analysis, to see. But I can think of some genres, for example, postmodern philosophical texts, and especially French literary theory and cultural theory into English in the second half of the 20th century. We would find a lot of interference and high tolerance of interference. That is, in those specific genres, the English language culture seems to accept a certain inferiority. Okay, those are just ideas to play with. I think descriptive translation studies has contributed some positive things to the study of translation. First, we've learned a lot about the historical variety and vitality of translation. It's become a much more interesting thing to study. Descriptive translation studies has helped us form a discipline called translation studies and accept its position as an interdiscipline, that is, an academic pursuit that will draw on concepts and tools from other sciences. Here we've looked at, for example, sociology, literary studies, cultural studies. We bring in bits and pieces of philosophy, of empirical methodology. We'll be looking at a bit of psychology and certainly linguistics later on. So this is the way translation studies works as an interdiscipline, and this has been formalized by the people in descriptive translation studies. And the knowledge that it has generated, I think, is useful not just for comparative literature, for example, but also for the prescriptive approaches that it originally opposed. For example, when training translators, we can certainly get them to reproduce the dominant norms of our day and age, as is usually done. But, as Turi says at one point, we could also get our students to break the norms. We can say, here, translate as you would have in the 12th century, or translate as Baudelaire translated Poe, for example, to make people critically aware that everything we're doing now could be otherwise. That is, the study of norms can become a force for the critical changing and challenging of norms. Descriptive translation studies has also done a lot to break down the great dichotomies of one or the other, of domestication versus foreignizing, for example, or free versus literal, or any of these very restrictive dichotomies. Not entirely. We still find that dichotomy in some of Turi's work, where he has his own opposition. But I think extending this kind of critical survey, especially into Asian cultures, African cultures, Southeast Asian cultures, recitative cultures, anything beyond the narrow European environment in which descriptive translation study was formulated,